In these times during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली जयपुर लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई एक सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information.
On behalf of festival co-directors Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, I welcome you back to this session of the Jaipur Literature Festival online series 2021. The second wave of COVID-19 has been at the heart of much pain and suffering, especially here in India. At this time, we wish to offer hope and knowledge by continuing our vision to ensure the free flow of conversations that impart information and address the many vital questions of our times through this digital series. Our session today is Finding the Raga and Improvisation on Indian Music, Amit Chaudhry in conversation with Katherine Butler Schofield. Acclaimed musician, novelist, and critic Amit Chaudhry's latest book, Finding the Raga and Improvisation on Indian Music, is an immersive journey through the rigorous beauty and cosmology of Indian classical music and its synergy with Western music and the world at large. Drawing on both Western and Indian sources, Chaudhry weaves together an intricate narrative on the process of finding the raga between life, music, and art. Chaudhry's books include Friend of My Youth and Calcutta. His second book out this year is Ramanujan, a collection of poetry. In conversation with Schofield, Amit Chaudhry reflects on his understanding of the tone and melody that has shaped his life and worldview. Amit Chaudhry is the author of 7 novels. He's also Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, Honorary Fellow of the Modern Language Association, and Professor of Contemporary Literature at the University of East Anglia, and Professor of Creative Writing at Ashoka University. He's also an essayist, a singer in the Hindustani classical tradition, and composer of and improviser in non-fusion music. Katherine Schofield is a historian of Hindustani music and Mughal India. In telling stories about musical lives, she writes on sovereignty and selfhood, affection and desire, sympathy and loss, and power, worldly and strange. Her latest book, Music and Musicians in Late Mughal India, Histories of the Ephemeral, 1748 to 1858, will be out with Cambridge University Press in 2022. Please do follow us on our handles Jaipur Lit Fest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on all our upcoming sessions. All our sessions that have been broadcast till now have been archived and are available on our website in the Mughal Tent venue. You can also watch them on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Finding the Raga and Improvisation on Indian Music, Amit Chaudhry in conversation with Katherine Butler Schofield. Over to you, Katherine.
Well, it's an absolute delight and a pleasure to be here with somebody I have admired for such a long time, Amit Chaudhry, who is, to my mind, one of India's greatest living writers on music, and somebody who is both a musician and a writer, and somebody who, feels as if, there's a considerable affinity with my own life, as I also started as a musician and then later moved into scholarship. I was a professional viola player before I came into this. And so his work has always resonated with me. And when I started my master's degree, when I first got interested in Hindustani music, I got interested in Hindustani music because it was created by the performer in the moment, which for somebody classically trained as I was, felt very, very exciting as well as very alien. And in my master's thesis, which was my first foray into writing about the history of Hindustani music, I used this quotation from his novel Afternoon Rag as the epigraph to the thesis. Nothing remains but the human voice, this tiny instrument inside the throat, endeavoring to carry a world inside it. Then that too becomes silent. The Rag, self-created galaxy of notes, sigh of the elements, sighs like the rain, passes into nature. And I hope that we are going to explore some of these concepts of the Rag, and particularly in its khayal form, emerging from the unmanifest sound of the cosmos into the manifest sound of music as we go through. But I want to start with a slightly more general question about this beautiful, melodious, languorous new book with its exquisite cover art in the UK edition, which actually really does remind me of the Rag meandering through the universe of sound. And I particularly like the fact that it's red for rung, and Rag and passion and all the things that Rag means. But so your music has always wound its way through your writing and through your narratives, and which has always fascinated me as somebody who is also really interested in stories about music and musicians, and how they work and what they mean. But I think this is, to me, your most personally musical book. What's really struck me about reading it is that it is very much about your youth and young adulthood, and this kind of finding of the Rag being tied up with that stage in your life. And right at the end, after the Rag has melted into nature, you talk about your more recent return to the music of your youth, and that really intrigued me, this relationship between your youth and your finding of the Rag. I'd really love you to elaborate a bit more on that.
Thank you, Catherine. Wonderful introduction, and such warm words, and based on your own memory of my earlier books, especially Afternoon Rug, that really means something to me. About my youth and the discovery of the Rag within it. I mean, I suppose that's what's contained to a certain extent in the title, the element of almost accidental discovery. And it's a reminder of the fact of my becoming more and more aware in the last kind of 2 decades or so, retrospectively, but also reassessing what I've read, who I've read about, the importance of chance and accident in where we end up, even if we end up there for a while before we move on again. So I would say that there was a period in which I discovered what kind of writer I was. That to me, the whole reassessment which came with that, to do with giving a fresh significance to the mundane, to that which was before you, but which you had noticed. That for me constituted the important move from an apprentice period, a love of the arts, a period fantasizing about the arts, about writing, about music, other things in life. I had left behind the early fantasies quite early on, the ones to do with becoming an army chief or a policeman. Though those were fantasies too. I'd left them early on, but the fantasy with writing, the fantasy with later on with becoming an air guitarist, then becoming a Canadian singer-songwriter, which translated from fantasy actually into a kind of practice for a while, because I began to play and compose music in that idiom, and those songs I would then broadcast on a slot I was given for some reason on All India Radio Bombay. And I've just compiled a collection of those songs and I've released them, and they are available. And it's an album called 17, referring to my age at that time. The songs I'd composed and sung between the age of 16 and say 20. Now, side by side with that, I was getting into Indian classical music, and my encounter with it began at that time when I was being a Canadian singer-songwriter at the age of 16. And I would never have expected it. I mean, if somebody had told me when I was 14 years old that this is what you're going to be doing, I mean, I wouldn't have believed them. It would have sounded implausible. Similarly, if somebody had said to me when I was every week enacting and following through on my fantasy of being a poet, and every week finding a new poet to imitate, whose language to inhabit, to produce kind of for Baudelaire or for Whitman, every week it being a new person. If somebody had said to me then that you are going to be writing novels from the age of 24 onwards, and that's what you're going to be doing for a long time, I wouldn't have believed them. So there's this question of accidentality, of not knowing where you're going to go next, of not knowing how you come upon it, which is so important. To move quickly from my youth to onwards into all those things that I've done, write a particular kind of novel, return to the poem. My third collection of poems is coming out, or is out in the UK around now, maybe tomorrow or whenever. And going back to listening to rock music, American folk rock, jazz, coming up with this kind of experiment. This is not fusion. All of these are the results, or they mark a life full of fitful turns that were not planned for. Each one of these turns then are followed through in order to create a body of work following that particular turn. So the body of work that comprises the novel, the body of work that comprises poetry, the recordings in Indian classical music, who I am as an Indian classical musician, the experiment, all of these are me responding to a turn which was not planned for, which seemed absurd at first when the idea of that turn presented itself. Because at the age of 16, I would have thought, no, this is not a good idea now to sort of start practicing Indian classical music, which I know nothing about, or at the age of whatever I was, 40 something, when I thought the Leela riff reminds, the practicing Tori Gama Dhani Dha reminds me of the riff to Leela. Let me see if I can follow through and create a composition that captures that segue and that transition. Those were the beginnings of that particular kind of project. So every project, every one of those turns has a moment where it begins and where it seems absurd and where you think, no, this is not a good idea. I mean, I think I just should keep doing what I'm doing. This is an absurd, implausible sort of idea that has come to me. And then I followed through. None of it has been planned for. But then once it presents itself, I very often do follow through and then build a kind of body of something. I try to, at least. I test the implausibility, and then I go there. And And that's how the whole engagement with Hindustani classical music began, unplanned for. If somebody had told me at the age of 5, now you must start practicing bandishes in whatever, Rag Bhupali and Yaman, I wouldn't have done it most probably, because I was so resistant to any form of pedagogy and study. So all of it has had to be unplanned for and then committed to with passion.
I love that, because actually that is, to me, it sounds like hell. And the idea that you have all of this riyaz that you've done, all this practice that you've done, all this preparation that you've done, but actually when you're in the moment, you start with something perhaps unplanned, and then you have to commit to it, as you say, and then you build on it, and then it becomes something, and then it cycles back to another moment of kind of unplanning. And I love this. And one of the things that I really relate to in what you've just said is my own experiences of khayal. So I studied khayal for 5 years, not with any intention of becoming a singer at all, but side by side with my historical studies, because I knew that if I didn't do that, I would never, ever understand the rag. I would never get inside the rag, and I would never be able to understand it. I had to embody it. And so I did it the absolute traditional way. I no notation, no recording, just rote learning from my ustad. And it was the most remarkable experience. But what was even more remarkable was what that did to my own violin playing, because I was still playing a lot when I was doing this. I play very little now, but and I was playing a lot of experimental music, a lot of jazz, and my abilities to improvise in that completely different system just went completely through the roof, because there was something about that, whatever was happening inside me because of the Hindustani music, that kind of related to what I was doing on my violin, which I had completely under my fingers. Whereas with khayal, of course, saying I did 5 years is like saying I have grade 1 violin or something. And okay, so let's turn to khayal then, and to the form that you use to write this book. And what I especially love about it is in the narrative form of a khayal, and most obviously with the considerably longest chapter being the first chapter, which is the alap, which you call the alap, the introductory elaboration, the barai, the progression. And you talk about your work sort of meandering and never quite coming to the point, a little bit like an endless knee, or an endless chord 5 for those of you who are interested in Western classical music, never ever quite getting to the resolution of the knee to sa or 5 to 1, is never quite getting there. And then you have this tihai of short chapters, these 3 short chapters where you do get to the points. You have this chapter on khayal, and then followed by the resolution into ananda, and then a post-performance return is what it feels like to me to what was before. And it really does remind me of the Sanskritic idea of nada brahma, of sound being God, God being sound, and that there are 2 types of sound in Hindustani music. So you have the ahatanada, which is the manifest sound of your musical performance, and an ahatanada, the unmanifest eternal sound of the cosmos, from which the raga emerges, and to which it returns at the end of the performance, and coming back to afternoon rag, sighs like the rain at the end and passes into nature. I've actually got 2 questions for you, but I wanted to ask a question about your alap, first of all, and about your relationship with your Guruji, Govind Prasad Jaipurwale. And if you might read a little bit about him, that would be absolutely wonderful, because to me, the structure of your barai, of your elaboration, your kind of tree-like progression through the alap of your book has a mukra, or a face. It has a sum, and that mukra or sum, you know, the beginning and end of the cycle seems to me to be Govindji. And of course, his untimely passing at the end is where you end your alap. So I'd love you to read a little about him and elaborate a little bit more, you know, wherever your imagination, wherever your khayal wants to go at this moment. I want to hear that.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm going to read in a second. Just thinking about what you said. So again, I mean, I don't want to sound as if I'm laboring a conceit or an idea, but again, it's what I didn't plan to write a book structured like a khayal, with alap and then, you know, drut, bandish or tihai or whatever. You've put it beautifully. That once you read it that way, it makes sense. Of course, I did name the first chapter alap. This is because I was genuinely, as I say in the first chapter, thinking, and I knew that the first chapter, I didn't quite know that I would include everything I did in that first chapter eventually. But I knew that it was going to be fairly longish, you know, that I was in the middle of this sounds weird, middle of beginning to write about, you know, why the rag isn't mimetic, according to me, in the way that we listen to scales in Western music, even though they well may not have intended to have a mimetic association, or they don't have a mimetic association for composers. The way we receive them is almost invariably that, you know, the major scale will have associations of happiness, the minor of sadness. So so I was in the middle of figuring all this out, as anybody who has composed or performed or dealt with two traditions in any sort of creative way will need to figure this out, you know. So I was in the middle of all of that. I'll come back to this whole business of figuring it out later on, if I may, as an Indian, you know, what it means to do that. But so I was working all that out, and I knew this is going to take me a little while. So it would be nice to call it alap, this section. Maybe I could call the book alap, I thought, you know. Why not call the book alap? Because while writing the alap, or that is the introduction, sorry, it wasn't the introduction, the first chapter, I suddenly thought alap, one of the meanings is introduction or prologue. How weird that we should have a form here. And I was thinking this literally for the first time, whose literal meaning means to, you know, introduction, that we haven't, this is alap, we haven't quite begun. We're beginning or about to begin. How extraordinary that we should stay with beginnings. And I had this investment here in focusing on this, something which I think none of us really notice, Catherine, because we aren't thinking of the word alap and everything it means. We just think of it as the substantial kind of exploration of the rag, which has been made even more substantial by singers like Ustad Amir Khan, whose legacy is again a very powerful and formative legacy in how we think about this music. So here we have this newly expanded, actually, if we think of it as immemorial, but if it was expanded or amplified by Amir Khan in the 40s, 30s, or whenever it was, a newly expanded, relatively speaking, a section of khayal, which which is actually supposed to be alap, an introduction. How extraordinary that we should have a form of music which is not concerned about the ending as it is with this moment it calls the beginning and its way of staying with the beginning. And I had a personal kind of, my inner ear pricked up. Pricked up to what I was thinking myself, because I had a personal investment in this. Because a few years before this, or around that time, I had written a couple of essays to say why I was against storytelling, and I said there that I'm not really concerned with the shackling of fiction and fictional narrative by everything that is supposed to happen. What excites me most is the promise of something happening. And the promise of something happening is contained for me most powerfully in the first paragraph or the first two paragraphs or the first two pages of a novel. After that, it's all domesticated into the action. But in the first paragraph or the first two paragraphs or the first pages, first 2 or 3 pages, there is no compulsion to be shackled in that way. There is a setting of the scene and entering into life in the midst of life and just kind of taking note of it with a new sort of wonder. So all you have in the first paragraphs is this registering of being in that world. Now, for me, the registering of this fact of being in the world is far more exciting than actually telling a story about what happens in that world. So I thought, how amazing. Now, I have made an argument that I want all my paragraphs to be opening paragraphs, whether or not they work. But I want every paragraph to be, as it were, not there in the service of advancing a narrative or telling a story, but to register again and again afresh this consciousness of being here, which the opening paragraphs do. So I thought, amazing that this is what, in a sense, the alap has been privileged to do, has been given the privilege of occupying this large space in which you register again and again a kind of encounter. Each time it's a fresh encounter. It's not to do with going from A to Z. It's this registering again and again, moment to moment, a new way of looking at this encounter. So I thought, this is amazing. Let me call the book Alap. And then, I didn't do that, but I called the first chapter Alap. I knew also that I was subverting in my book and also in that first chapter the usual expectations that the word introduction has when it comes to any form of knowledge, especially any form of knowledge that is foreign to oneself, when one is presenting that knowledge. This is a book that will introduce you to Indian music. This is a book that will introduce you to chess. This is a book that will introduce you to football. My book was not going to be such an introduction. So I knew I was also punning on the word and belying expectations, and thereby sort of allowing something else to come into existence. So there was all of that going on when I wrote that, and then it became longer, the alap, and actually it then took up 2/3 of the book. So yeah, then it fits in with your reading very well, and I'm aware of that. And it's fun for me. It's fun that it worked out that way.
Yeah, well, and it works beautifully, actually, this idea that you have this series of beginnings. I just think it's lovely.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question? I mean, did I miss something?
Well, we were talking about, I was asking about your relationship with Govind Devji, not Govind Devji, Govindji.
Yes.
And I've been working on Jaipur and Salt for the last 3 months. So not Govind Devji, but Govindji. Yeah. The mukta or the sum.
Yes. Thank you for putting it that way. Yes, the book does begin. The journey begins with him, and the chapter, that first opening chapter, also ends with him. So yes, he is a kind of sum, the first, and the return to the one, in that particular structure. Yeah, he is one of the reasons that I got into Indian classical music. He was teaching my mother devotionals. He arrived as a new teacher of devotionals. He was a great classical singer, one of the greatest of the last century. Anybody in this age of hype, yeah, just don't listen to my words. Go to YouTube and listen to his recordings. Somebody says, and this is true of me as well, that we used to read the first two or three paragraphs of books, and if we liked the two or three paragraphs, we would know whether this was a good writer or not. It's the same with melody or sur. Uh, this poet Ronaji Dash said it's like Sufism, direct contact. Believe in direct contact. Let there be no mediation. So go to YouTube, listen to him. But certainly for me, it was direct contact. Listening to him, modulations from line to line is something that I discovered through him as being part of the great imaginative potential and understanding of detail, the potential of detail in Indian classical music. I'm just going to read out a tiny bit. This is not going to be really so much about him, though he's mentioned here, but it's going to be about his brother, Girdhar Prasad Jaipurwala, a great tabla player, and also about this. It's about listening. A lot of the book is about hearing, listening, not to music, but to sounds. When I was growing up in Bombay, because I grew up for many years, my parents lived on the 12th story of a building and on the 25th story. I didn't have access to sound as such. So when you speak about the sound of the universe, when Indians speak about it, especially in connection with music, they immediately go into this kind of mystical haze because of the word universe, which I've used in my poem as well, the one you read out from. But for me, all these sounds, the sound of the universe is very important, but it includes everything. I mean, it includes car horns, sound of crows, overheard speech, all of it. It's interesting how the rag really exists in that context. So moving to the third story apartment, my parents had moved to the third story apartment of this to this building in Bandra, which was slightly on the outskirts of Bombay compared to where I had grown up. And they moved there after my father retired. And I was in England by this time. So when I first returned to them in Bombay, after they'd moved to this flat, I was woken up, Catherine, in spite of jet lag. I had arrived quite late and I sat up late talking to my mother. Then I was woken up by this din, which was quite terrifying. And the din was actually bird call. And I'd never heard it before, that volume of the bird call, especially on the 25th story or the 12th story. And in St. Cyril Road, which is the name of the road in Bandra where they were, I began to have this freer access to sound, let alone the street, which was so important to me as a person, as a writer, as a musician. So I'm just going to read out a little bit from here where I'm making mention of Govindji, Girdharji and Hazari Lalji, who was Govindji's brother-in-law and played the harmonium with me sometimes. Practice sessions with Govindji, Girdharji on the tabla and sometimes with Hazari Lalji, either on the tabla or harmonium, took place in the sitting room or in my bedroom or in my parents' room. Now, this is the new, smaller flat in St. Cyril Road that I'm talking about. Wherever we sat, there was access through the open doors of two balconies to St. Cyril Road. Besides the cries of school children and the revving of auto rickshaws, part of the sound of the universe that I was referring to earlier, there were sounds peculiar to the area. A high-pitched bell was struck late in the afternoon. Although I never saw him, I learned it was the kulfi wala announcing his entrance. Hearing the bell, Girdharji said, "Pancham mein bol raha hai," or "It's hit the fifth." That is the fifth or pa in relation to my tonic, probably F on the harmonium, to which you would have tuned the tabla with a hammer a little while ago. It wasn't a comment he'd have made in Cuff Parade, which is where we lived on the 25th story. Since Indian music has no natural C to which the scales are tied via the piano, the tonic and its intervals are potentially everywhere in your proximity. The Indian classical music is a comparativist. Not only does he test notes in relation to each other, in a raga, he hears extensions of that relationship in his surroundings. There may be conflicts too. The ear of the classical musician is subconsciously alert to air conditioning because a drop in temperature can affect the tanpura's tuning, but also because the air conditioner may be humming at a pitch, a note that's absent in the raga. Girdharji's remark makes me think of Bharat's analogies attributing the origins of the 7 notes of the scale to animal and bird sounds. He may have included industrial sounds if he'd lived in the 20th century. Bandra was predominantly a Roman Catholic area. This gave it its unhomelikeness. St. Andrew's Church and School were a few minutes walk away from my parents. The area had its own economy, even its own food, vendors, and vagrants. A young Maharashtrian came regularly to my mother with a basket of produce. A man on a bicycle cart supplied bread in the afternoon. It was wrapped in paper and slipped in through a gap in the doorway to my mother or me or a maid. Touching it, I'd find it was warm. It was like a still living thing, one of the many beings that entered the universe for a short period and disappear before they become old or unwanted. I touched it a couple of times. The warmth was like a sting. I must have had something of the damp of London in me because I'd begun to associate warmth with life. The 3rd story flat placed my consciousness in the world near the street. St. Cyril Road became part of my education as a writer and musician. The open window in my room confirmed to me that the self has no center. It's never fully present. It's always overhearing something. Warren Street was an education too. It represented interiority. It made me realize the pervasiveness of psychology, inwardness, and silence. Writing and music must be a liberation from these, just as St. Cyril Road was an escape from Warren Street.
That's so beautiful and particularly resonant. I love this idea that actually the rag in India, sung in India in your flat on the third floor, is completely different from the same rag, same composition sung in Warren Street in London, in central London, and the idea that music can be really embedded in place. And I'm thinking about this as I'm sitting here in my sitting room, and I can hear my son's feet thundering up and down the stairs, and I can hear the railway line and the aeroplanes going overhead out of my left ear. As hopefully none of you can hear that, but it's actually part of this conversation, these things, and it's what locates us. We've got to come to an end, unfortunately, within the next 2 to 3 minutes, but I just wanted to continue to riff on this a little bit and think about music entering the everyday life of hearing. I love what you say about double hearing or doubleness or mishearing in the last chapter. So, you let us know that your favorite Beethoven symphony is the 7th Symphony, which is also my favorite symphony. And of course, we're going to come at it from completely different backgrounds. You with your training in Hindustani, mine with my training in Western classical music. I've played all the Beethoven symphonies professionally. And what strikes me, which sort of thinking about double hearing, and the fact that I still hear Rag Malconche sometimes completely incorrectly and confuse sa and ma with pa and sa, but you can get lost sometimes. And your discussion about Leila and hearing that in Gujri Tori and thinking, whoops, I'm a little bit lost, but let's play with that. And so this idea that you can come from somewhere and then encounter something else and hear these different things. So I just want to leave on a sort of a note about happiness, because actually your epigraph to the book is from Kishore Amankar, talking about unhappiness and happiness, and ultimate happiness being, ananda, and at the end, once the rag has died away. And I was really struck by the very short passage on layakari, on playing or working with time and pulling time and rhythm apart, and how 17 goes into 16 and all of these kinds of things. And as a musician, what I was relating to was the fact that when I run, I get huge amounts of pleasure as a musician out of breathing 3 against 2. Breathing 3, legs doing 2 or 4. And if we could just end with happiness and what do you think music's ability to play with time and the time of mortality, the time of immortality, what does it have to, why does it make us happy?
Since we don't have too much time left, coming back to the notion of time, but I do want to address this, but also prior to that, very quickly touch upon what we were talking about earlier, the Rift to Leila, Gujri Thori, what I just read out, the kulfi seller's bell and pa, the note pancham in relation to what I might have been singing. So it's clear that a particular kind of thinking brings out everything we know in comparison to another. So we are always finding new meanings through the relationality of things, not in some kind of sense that everything adds up to a harmonious whole, but because we know so many things that appear to be in conflict or not related to each other, but which throw a different kind of light or create a different kind of outline in things we think we know all the time. I don't think this can only be true of, say, some idealized figure of the Indian who's been between cultures, or the modern who's been between cultures. It has to be true of the very evolution of culture itself, of all of us. This is just one way of bringing it to the forefront of our consciousness, that we are always making comparisons. Is a poor word. I can't think of any other word, right now, and we don't have time to think about another word. As far as time in music is concerned, in Hindustani classical music, you picked up on, you mentioned Ananda, you've mentioned the joy caused by Laikari and the joy caused by the note itself. That also, as a musician who's drawn to the tone of the voice, to the timbre of the voice, to the note as being more important, as having its own emotion over and above any emotion that the singer might have, which is why we can listen to the Tanpura endlessly. It's not just there to give us a reference. It is that we tune it, and then we do get drawn to it.
Oh yes,
we kind of get drawn to it, but it's only playing 2 notes. Yeah. But the resonance, the juari, that the string placed, the thread placed at the right point of the bridge down has creates that kind of hypnosis. So tonality is and the tone and the note, which is why we tune the Tanpura obsessively until we get it completely right, is very important in our experience of joy in music. And it can be something as even as simple as those 2 notes played on the Tanpura. With Laikari, it's a different kind of joy, of a very complicated form of fun, a very cerebral form of fun, which which is not incompatible with a kind of almost spiritual pleasure in being calm in the face of excitement. You know, you were speaking about breathing 3 times and while your steps were covering, you know.
Yeah, 3 against 2. You
Right.
press 3 while my legs are going 1, 2, 1, 2, 1.
Absolutely. So one of the things that Laikari is doing, like I've mentioned that this bandish which I sing, I won't sing it now, but you know the words are badi badi akhiyan me kajara sohe. Now in 16 beats, badi badi akhiyan me. Me is the syllable on which you have the sum. Badi badi akhiyan me kajara sohe. Na din din na badi badi akhiyan me kajara sohe. Badi badi akhiyan. Badi badi akhiyan me. Badi badi akhiyan me. Badi badi akhiyan me. Now, let's say I decided to start it from anywhere. Akhiyan me kajara sohe. Badi badi akhiyan me. Badi badi akhiyan me. Badi badi akhiyan me. Okay. So I didn't know how. So this is converting a mistake, a potential mistake, into the right kind of moment. So I'm taking a risk. I didn't know where it would end or how I'd end it, how I'd manage the tihai when I began it from that particular point in time, which is not where I'm supposed to start it from. So the risks involved in are a part of play, but notice that I am quite still when I'm doing this.
Oh.
You know, I'm not kind of getting into a state.
Yeah.
So there is this balance between composure and excitement there, which maybe is which is the pleasure of mathematics.
Yeah.
So this is besides tone, besides hypnosis, the hypnotic quality of tone, there is this is being explored to a great extent in Indian classical music. This balance between composure and excitement that comes from very complicated, very nuanced mathematical kind of permutations, and also risk-taking, so that you have developed your instinct to a certain extent to be able to take that risk, which I did right now, fearing that I would fall and embarrass myself, but thankfully didn't.
So we are back now to the unplanned and to the pushing through, the commitment to it, even if it's a risk. It's been an absolute pleasure. I could talk to you for hours and hours. Instead, it's time for us to come to an end. I'm going to go away, and it's afternoon here, so I'm going to listen to an afternoon rag. And thank you so much for this beautiful book. I just held it up backwards. And it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today.
Pleasure to talk to you as well, Catherine. Yeah, thank you.
That was a perfect note to end the session. Thank you, Amit and Catherine, for that musical session. We look forward to reading the book soon. Thank you all for watching and being a lovely audience. As you all are aware, the grave repercussions of COVID-19 have set us back in ways that we could have never imagined. In our efforts to rebuild the devastating impact suffered by the arts sector, Teamwork Arts launched Art Matters in 2020, through which we've been working towards creating awareness about the current reality of artists across India affected by the pandemic and developing support channels for them. With the onset of this virulent second wave, we again face unprecedented and heartbreaking challenges. We have launched an emergency fund to provide them with a range of resources, from food and rations to healthcare and medicines. You can also contribute by pressing the contribute button on the right-hand side of your screen. On behalf of all of us, stay safe, stay double-masked, and we will see you next week with JLF First Edition book launch. Our session is The Light of Asia, the poem that defined the Buddha. Jairam Ramesh in conversation with William Dalrymple. This will be on Friday, 11 June at 7 p.m. IST. Good night and see you next week.
during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली जयपुर लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई एक सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information.